Welcome. I'm Gary Parr, and in a couple of minutes we'll have our show with this week's guest, Patricia Nguyen of Thistle Threads. And this is one of those shows where we're going to have a Sunday audio podcast and then follow that with a Wednesday live show with Tricia. And so September 16 at 8 o'clock p.m. Eastern Time on the Fiber Talk YouTube channel, Tricia will be live with us, and something we didn't talk about in today's podcast is her caskets and her casket courses. And so Wednesday night, you're going to get a full tour of caskets. She's going to have an original antique one and then the ones that she has created from that. And you'll get to see all the ins and outs and secret chambers of a casket and the threads that go into it, and learn about everything that goes into stitching and assembling a casket. So join us Wednesday night at 8 o'clock Eastern Time for that. And this week's show is sponsored by Sassy Jack Stitchery and Needle in a Haystack. And Sassy Jacks, we have several new things coming up with Kim at sassyjackstitchery.com. One is a brand new sampler, Christian Henry 1816. That's a new sampler in the Sassafras Samplers line, and you'll want to visit the website and order that. And, of course, Kim has kits put together for that, too. Then also coming up, a new sampler from Jeanette Douglas, Hollandsey Merklop. And that is one beautiful piece. So visit the website to check that out. And then also ongoing now is the Learning Stitches course. And be sure you buy the book. If you don't do the stitches, buy the book because it's an excellent resource. And then following that, and it'll be a few weeks before that course ends, then Kim is going to start a new course, My Stitching Album, also from Jeanette Douglas. And that is another excellent opportunity and book to learn stitches and create yourself a little catalog of sampler stitches that you can use as a reference as you do other projects. Then be sure and mark down, and registration is coming up soon, May 2021. All things go well, will be a live seminar with Jeanette Douglas at Sassy Jacks in Weaverville, North Carolina. That'll be Tapestry of Stitches project. And you got to see a little bit of that in last week's Wednesday show with Jeanette. And that is a gorgeous piece. And so you're going to want to get in line quickly because that course will fill up fast. And get on the list for Tapestry of Stitches because that is one beautiful piece that Jeanette has created. And then to be able to go to Sassy Jacks and take that course with Jeanette live will be a real treat. So watch for that at Sassy Jacks. Get on the news list. Just get on the newsletter list and follow in the Facebook group. And then you'll be informed when these things are available, and but act quickly because they fill up fast. Then our other sponsor, Needle in a Haystack, needlestack.com. And Kathy Ray, as I've said many times, is the resource there if you are putting together kits online or need help replacing threads that no longer exist or just need help putting together colors for a project. Kathy will help you. And she is just fantastic talent when it comes to that kind of thing. So keep needle in a haystack, needlestack.com on your list if you need help, especially online. She's particularly good with that, and will be a real big help to you. Now, it's always fun to poke around in the Needle in a Haystack website because for me it's like treasure hunting, and I learned something new. Kathy carries the K's Creation stands, all the full line of stands, and my current favorite is my new stowaway floor stand. Video coming up soon on that, but oh boy, when I got that stand set up and started stitching with my Millennium frame on there, what a treat. That thing is just perfect, and then it folds right up and stows away and is out of the way for you when you're not using it. But something else I did not know that K's Creation makes is called a rod tightener, and that's for 11/16" scroll rods, and that is a handy little device for getting really tight tension on scroll rods, particularly for larger pieces. So check that out. I did not know they made that rod tightener, 11/16-inch rods only, but that will allow you to get excellent tension on big pieces of linen. Then also, Kathy carries slate frames, found that from Access Commodities, did not know she had those. And you'll want to also be sure and get in on the Stitching Has Its Rewards card so that you can accumulate points and save money down the road. And of course, if you go to the fabrics page, there's all kinds of resources for how to select fabric, what different kinds of fabric are and what they are best for. So be sure and visit that. And there's a couple things to download there that you'll want to keep as resources. And then on top of all that, Kathy carries the full line of Hardwick Manor hoops, and those are my favorite. And you'll want to check that out too. So needlestack.com, Needle in a Haystack, and thanks to both Sassy Jacks and Needle in a Haystack for sponsoring this show. And now we'll listen to the conversation I had with Tricia Nguyen of Thistle Threads. Welcome back. I'm Gary Parr, and you are listening to Fiber Talk, the twice weekly podcast for needlework artists. And our artist this week, Tricia Wilson Nguyen. Hi, Tricia.
Hi, Gary.
Glad to have you with us. Boy, we've been trying to get this together for some time now. Finally, success.
I think it's been at least a year, actually. I'm busy.
Yeah, our schedules never would mesh. So, Yep. No, I appreciate you doing it. And so in doing my research here, you know, you're an engineer, material scientist, blah, 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 all those things. And typically that is a mindset that always wants to move forward and create.
Yes.
But then I look at all you've done with embroidery, thread development, thread studies, history, research, all those things. And the thread that carries through all of that is clearly a love and commitment to the history. So what is it about the history that drives you?
Well, let me tell you kind of where some of that came from. Two things. One is that I studied Japanese embroidery when I was 12 to about 21. And so that gave me an appreciation of cultures and of a very unbroken history of a technique and the power of that. And then when I went to college at MIT, there was a woman there named Heather Leckman who was a material scientist, and she had kind of carved out a very specialized area in the department called the Materials Archaeology and Anthropology group. And what she did was she studied historic problems, especially, in archaeology especially, using the knowledge of material science. And that was looking at objects, figuring out how they were made, and answering questions about the cultures and the peoples. I found that incredibly fascinating. In particular, she was looking at Inca gold and how the Incans believed in the sun, moon, and earth, and they used gold, silver, and copper to represent that. And all of their objects are actually tri-metal alloys of those three things, where they used urine to deplete the surface so it looks like gold. And she went in depth into all of the Spanish writings by the conquistadors. They took boatloads of these items back to Spain and they melted them down and they went, oops. So it wasn't solid gold. And as I said, I found that fascinating. So I took all of her coursework and started studying the history of silk and the use of textiles. And, kind of one of those things, I was like, God, if I could ever find a career where I could mix my love for high technology, engineering, and history, that would be, that's the holy grail. And I got there.
First of all, serves the conquistadors, serves them right for stealing all that stuff and not getting solid gold. Too bad for you.
Exactly. Yep.
So that whole process then, basically, here's an object, here's a piece of material, let's look at how it's made, and then that gives you clues as to what their technical capabilities were, what tools they were using, in the case of urine, what chemistry they were using.
Exactly. But also it gives you like what's important to a culture and why is this being done this way. We don't do things for no reason. We do it because it's culturally important to us. And so you can study a former culture through their decorative arts, or material culture. That's a whole field of study, is material culture. And to be able to bring to it a actual knowledge of how things are physically made and the analytical techniques to look at that, you can get farther in that answering of, questions. And for me, I would say that it wasn't too long after I got out of graduate school. I was back in Boston, and I think at the time I may have even been pregnant. And I was at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. They had a massive exhibition of 17th century embroidery that I was fascinated by because it was so difficult and different. I mean, it was really different than what we tend to do today. The band samplers, we obviously were doing them today, but that's only a small subset of what was accomplished in that period. And there was so much of it accomplished. So it kind of immediately says to you, kind of why? Why did they do? This is a long time ago. And someone let me into the back room, and they had some objects out right after the exhibition was done, one of which was a jacket, an embroidered jacket from 1620-ish, only embroidered in gold and silver. And I thought, wow, that's beautiful, right? And I was looking at it closely with the curator, Pam Parmel, and I started looking at closer and closer, and I was pretty accomplished at that point as an embroiderer. I'd done all this Japanese embroidery. I'd done a lot of Western embroidery. And as I'm looking closer and closer at it, I went, I don't know what these stitches are. I really don't know what these stitches are. And I'd done detached buttonhole and a few other things before, and it wasn't that. And that's what was listed in the object labeling. And so she and I started pulling all the, this was interesting to her too, when I posed the question, what is this? She and I pulled out all of the books in the library there. We could not find it documented anywhere, any of the 4 stitches that we found on this jacket. That really bothered me. And I took pictures very close up. And it also bothered me to see, essentially, they took a gold thread, they took it through linen, and they did like what I would call kind of knots, like, it's like not even a 16th of an inch, and this gold thread is twisting around. And I said, could I do that now? Because I was doing gold thread in Japanese embroidery. And so I started when I went to my Japanese embroidery classes, I showed them the pictures. I tried to stitch out with the threads, and I was like, the thread wouldn't do that. It just wouldn't do what was done in the 17th century. And I'm like, why? Why?
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yes.
And so that was really the origin of so much of what I do, because I couldn't figure out how they made the thread to do that, what needle they were using, and then the big question of why would you go through that trouble?
yeah, there's that too, yes.
And that has become a lifelong research project in a way as to why were the 17th century embroiderers embroidering objects and clothing so heavily with gold and silver. And I think I have a hypothesis, and I'm still working on it, but so far it's panning out. I think they were bank accounts.
Oh, really?
Yes. And so this leads me down the track of studying economic history of the 17th century, very in depth. And my students, when they take my classes, if they're taking a kind of a large online class that's more of a survey course, they get all of this in their lessons. Is my research is being written at the same time, and so I'm talking to them about that, and I encourage them all to go why and to ask me questions, and we debate it and things. So economic history. So there was no banking system in the 1700s. The first bank opened up in England in 1699 at the same exact time that these complex stitches in Goldwork, which are there more than 50 that I've documented now, disappear completely from the lexicon of embroiderers.
Huh.
Okay.
That can't be a coincidence. Yeah.
In my mind, it can't be a coincidence. There is well-documented work by people in women's studies and other areas of history that textiles were a very pawnable item, very valuable, more highly valued than today. And so jump ahead to this Plymouth jacket project that I did. So, here's this jacket, this 1620s jacket that gets me interested in this question of goldwork. We rush ahead about 15 years, and I get a phone call from Plymouth Plantation where they say, we would like to reproduce one of these jackets. And we know that you've been looking at this problem, because I had met many of the people in the staff there over the years. And would you like to be involved in this project to reproduce this jacket? And I said, you're crazy. It's a jacket that's all needle lace and gold threads. And I said, some of these threads don't even exist. And I said, well, I'll come talk to you because I got to show you how crazy you are, But I'm kind of one of those people like, somebody says, let's do something crazy. And I'm like, when?
Yeah, yeah.
But I went down there and I showed them a lot of things and they still were enthusiastic. And I'm like, okay, you're a crazy bunch. And I told the director directly, I am not interested in doing a project where we present to the public a jacket that's been re-embroidered with a different stitch in DMC floss.
Yeah.
I'm only interested in a project where we push embroidery forward, meaning educating the public, and push the field forward, skill development, skill understanding, etc. And he said, sign me up. And I'm like, okay, so that these threads don't exist. And he said, well, could they? And I said, well, let me take a whack at it. So I started contacting the manufacturers I had just been starting to work with in Europe and convincing them to help. I had to put up the money, I had to find an outlet for it, etc. And we started prototyping the threads. So this jacket, this whole concept of the jacket, right, is a theme that goes through my work.
Well, let me back you up here now. All right. So threads that don't exist in a jacket, right, you can't tear apart to see how they're put together. Take me through that mental process, because that's not easy.
Well, it isn't, and the people at the Plymouth Plantation wardrobe department, as well as several other wonderful experts in textiles, whether it be curators at different museums, people like Wendy White down at the Cape, who has a jewelry background as well as a needlework background, myself, people who are experts in lace making. We worked for 2 years before we broke ground on this jacket, where we actually started stitching it. So we had to research jackets that it still existed, portraiture, figuring out which jacket would we try to reproduce. Mm-hmm. And that meant that the museum that owned it had to be amenable to that kind of reproduction. The V&A was. They had a great relationship. I had to fly around the country. Most of the jackets, there's 15 in Europe, in England, and then there's 3 in the United States, to go visit them all. We opened them up, we looked at them, we studied the stitches, we took macro photography all over them, and we discussed which would be the best for both a reproduction project and which would be the best from a visual standpoint to the viewer. So something with only 3 repeating motifs is not as interesting as something with like 10 and a bunch of bugs, because a little girl wants to look around and say, "Oh, I found a worm, mommy." So we wanted something very interesting. I also wanted something with a lot of different stitches on it, because then we would be able to cover up the hand, because we knew it would not be embroidered by 3 people. We would have to have an army.
Yes.
And then we wanted something colorful. So we ended up choosing a embroidery pattern that was at the V&A on one of their jackets, but that jacket had actually been cut down previously and was remodeled about 100 years later. So we used a well-studied by Janet Arnold, who is a phenomenal costume researcher who's passed on. She had done the Leighton jacket, which is another jacket at the V&A, and so we had a pattern resource already for that. And it was a resource that the Plymouth Wardrobe Department had used before. So that was phenomenal. And I also knew, and this is where studying an object in depth really starts to give you clues as to what happened in that period of time. I knew that there was a piece at the Embroiderers Guild in England in their collection that almost matched the jacket we were choosing. And now that was great because it was flat. And we could take pictures of it and we could transcribe the pattern. Oh. What we did not realize at the time, but when you start working with one object and you try to reproduce it, and this is why experimental archaeology is so important to do, is that you get into the mindset of the people that did it. And you see things you wouldn't see if you didn't try to do it. So as we started to do that, we realized that the vine pattern was the same for these jackets. And then we started finding more pieces out there that had the same motifs, but maybe in a different order on the same vine pattern. What we concluded was it was definitely a professional workshop. The professional workshop had a master vine pattern drawn out that they could copy, and then they placed motifs on it based on what the customer was requesting. So we're talking about a Gucci situation. And that was a new insight into what was going on at that time period. So we would go through the actual, I took photography of all of the parts of this jacket as well, measurements off the threads, etc., color measurements, and we went from there.
But you still have to have threads made.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, because to me, all that, that's all really neat stuff, but you still have to make threads.
Yes.
That match, and you don't have the people who made the threads to talk to.
No, we don't. So that's where, I did, I don't know how many years, 20, 25 years or so, I guess, in engineering. And as a material scientist, you study all kinds of different things from metallurgy, which has been invaluable for doing metal thread reproduction, as well as high-tech fibers. And that was the area that I ended up going into more than anything else as a professional, is high-tech fibers, developing the next Kevlar. So I was already very familiar with fiber manufacturing, whether it be natural fiber processing or making synthetic fibers. And so that gave me a leg up when going to work with these historic manufacturers, because to them, somebody coming in who says that they want this reproduction material, but not understanding what that means for them from I have to start with this kind of volume, but I knew that already because I did that for a professional living. And I could come in saying, okay, what is the volume that you need to dye this color at so that we can get this color that we want?
So so then they know you understand what they're up against.
And I'm constantly looking for ways to make it easier for them to help me. That's really what it is. So if they have to dye, let's say a 3 kilogram or a 10 kilogram batch to get that blue that I need, then I have to buy that 10 kilogram batch. Which means then I'm asking them quickly technical questions. Well, can you dye the floss silk, which is called a voile, and swap Paris at the same time in the same batch? And they say yes. I'm like, okay, great. Now I've got a color over here and in 2 different forms. Can you dye 4 of them? Well, yes. So now I have a range of colors. So you are always looking for opportunities to fulfill their needs and fulfill your needs and provide it to the commercial space and get it sold. Maybe. So I did quite a bit of, at that time, designing small projects for teaching or for retail sale that would use up the extra material that the project would not use.
So then that allowed you to recoup at least some of your costs.
Exactly. And it requires the kind of planning that engineers do, right? Which is a 10-year plan.
Yes.
And I always have a 10-year plan in my, written down, which says, so maybe I'm making a thread today and I'm going to use 20% of it today, but I already have the plan for how the rest of it's going to go and where it's going to go. So that I can, I'm not kind of willy-nilly doing this, and that has enabled the distributors and the manufacturers, because I share that plan with them, and they know that that I'm what I'm going to do and how I'm going to recoup the cost. And often I spent 10 years saving everything that I had made in needlework just to be able to do my casket project, so that I had capital to buy what I needed to buy and have it manufactured. Yeah. So once we get the silk in the right colors, and we're not doing this in a vacuum either. I'm working with all the manufacturers at the same time, going to them and, what do we need as the base? Here's the size. What have you already got? Can we make a prototype in between before we get the color dyed? Let me try that. Let me try the stitch mechanics. Does it work out? Maybe not. Maybe let's try it a little bit differently. This is what I'm measuring in the microscope, So we're going back and forth constantly. And we might make the first color as a trial, and we see whether or not it works out.
And that's interesting there when you say the stitch mechanics, because yes, you can make a fiber or a thread. You can create that stuff all you want, but if it doesn't work on the actual ground cloth with the stitch you need to produce, it's useless. Yes.
100%. It's totally useless. And it also has to go through the thought process of, maybe I'm really, dexterous and will take the pain and suffering of using this difficult to use thread, but will the average embroiderer be able to use it? Mm-hmm. So I might, use people I know as test, to help test me a thread. Or if I find it finicky in this way, we might try to do a little modification. But also I have to say, if we find it finicky, we did something wrong, because they were embroidering with this in mass in the 17th century. Right. And so what I always do, I might start embroidering something and I'm taking macro photography of it, and I look at it and see, well, look, that in some cases, let's say the metal strip or the metal wire wrapped around a thread breaks and it kind of bunches up on itself. And you go, oh no, that's a defect. Did I design this thread wrong? And you go back and look at the macro photographs of the jacket and you go, my God, that was happening everywhere for them. They just left it. Like us Americans we take it out, but they just left it. And we got to a really funny phrase, in the workshop as everybody's working, we're like, it's good enough for government work, We left it in the end because it was historically accurate. And so sometimes we this is a point that it really bothers me how a certain arts and crafts mentality that came in the 1900s, early 1900s, has kind of pervaded embroidery today with this whole idea of perfection. 17th century embroidery is hard and amazing and uses incredible threads, and there are mistakes everywhere, and the backs look horrible. And they were creative and they were fearless, and even the people making things professionally, it was not perfect. And we keep our own selves from doing things because we think everything has to look perfect, because we don't have usually the luxury of looking at these pieces in person, in the back, and up close to see that they're riddled with mistakes, what we would call mistakes. Yeah. What they just called an artifact of doing. And, and this comes home to me with something that I learned in Japanese embroidery, and I tell all my students, they wear obis on the back of the kimono, right? So it goes around the sash, it goes around the kimono, and that's what all the embroidery is on the obi. No one would ever stick their nose in a Japanese lady's butt to see how perfect that embroidery is. That is rude as anything. And so when you're embroidering Japanese embroidery and your design has been pulled out of skew, so your circle is now an oval, they force you to stitch it as a circle and you haven't covered the line. Because nobody will ever get that close to it to notice that you didn't cover the line. Uh-huh. They will see that it's not a circle from 3 feet away. So, it's this whole concept of the needlework police kind of keeps our modern embroiderers from really enjoying themselves.
Yeah, and you're speaking to someone who I tend to be a perfectionist, and I rip things out, and I really struggle to just let things go. And so it's, I guess, a comfort to me to hear that it's quite all right. It's been done for decades, for centuries.
Well, I have a student, and people can look this up online in my Cabinet of Curiosities courses. Her name is Janet Brandt, and she makes absolutely phenomenal work. And I have to say that I told her not long ago that I saw her as the Van Gogh of embroidery. She is creative. She has a unique vision. Her embroidered caskets all have a storyline all over them, but she has a painterly style of stitch that we wouldn't call perfect, but it is expressive, and it expresses the emotion she wants to convey. Like Van Gogh, right? Mm-hmm. Van Gogh kind of slopped on paint, but none of us would say that his work is awful. He was using paint as a medium to express what he wanted to say. And Janet is the same exact way. And I think all of us should feel that way, where we can use thread to express what we want to get out of it.
Yeah. Well, see, there's two things there. A question that floats in my head a lot is, are we better embroiderers today than they were in the 16th, 17th century? Because we assume we are. But I think if you look at the history, I think you can make a pretty good argument that we're not even close in some instances. But then Beth and I have been talking here in recent weeks about the willingness to ask what if as a needle artist, to take a design, a pattern, a thread, or whatever it is, and say, what if I did this? Right. What if I try this and see what happens? And so to break out of that mold of follow the directions and do not vary, but to so that those two kind of almost come together for me in terms of the creativity question. Yes.
Well, I applaud like if a student showed me a piece that I designed that I put out for a class and it was exactly a copy of what I did, I'm going to applaud their technical learnings, but I'm going to be a little sad that they didn't do something a little different. I don't care. Change a color, make it yours. Mm-hmm. If I've got a embroidered cabinet and you're taking the course and you say, I live in Australia and I want the flowers around the outside here to be Australian flowers, I'm like, can I help you figure out how to do that?
Yeah.
Make it your own and express yourself in it. I'm all for that. And I had an experience with my own family. We have 4 quilters in the family. We used to quilt together. And when my grandmother was just an amazing quilter, and as she aged and she started losing her sight, she had macular degeneration in one eye, and she now saw, how like things shift in where they are versus what you see. Mm-hmm. So she'd have to like put the fabric she would aim a 1/4 of an inch off of where it was supposed to be so that it actually sewed right. And then she got to the point where her vision was so bad that she couldn't see to put something through the sewing machine. So she said, okay, I'm going to use that kind of glue, Stitch Witcheries type of stuff. And she's going to glue snips of fabric down. Her work, when she was losing her eyesight, was the best work of her life because it was all expressive. It was an artist. She was snips of quilt fabric, and the color. We always had to have her help us with color because she had fuzzy vision. She saw it for what it was.
Yeah.
And so I love seeing people just, it's not where you are in skill, it's what do you want to express.
So now that, because the one thing that stuck out in my research about you that you had written somewhere, where your mother commented about you furthering her projects. So now I can see where that comes from. Yes, we have a history of it really comes from being frugal, from being not having a lot of money. So there's a lot of clothes sewing in the family, and my mother was very adept at that, and she was young and had a couple kids and needed an outlet, so she started with an embroiderers guild that was starting out, and she would bring home projects, and I would kind of, when she was cooking, I would sneak a few stitches. And I may have thought I was doing well, but I probably wasn't because she noticed. So she gave me my own work, and then she started lying to the EGA locally that she didn't have childcare so that I could come to the meetings. Oh.
And they would say, well, if she could play in the corner, but I would just pull up a chair and I would start doing the project too. And then I think they caught on about the time I was like 11 that this wasn't really, childcare issues.
Right.
And so they let me join. So I was really young EGA member. And then I ran through everything they were teaching and got really interested in other stuff that was coming out at the time. You know, there's waves of popularity of technique, and Hardanger became very popular at the time. And so I just was enthralled with Hardanger and just ran myself through it, and started teaching it to the guild. I was 13.
Why not? Why not?
They were very nice to me. They all took my little class and everything. They didn't know that they were spawning a lifelong obsession.
Well, and obviously the teaching started early, but it fascinates me that you were doing Japanese embroidery at such a young age, because that's usually, that's people tackle that well into their lives.
I'm a fortunate person that I just happened to grow up in a place where there was a kind of an embroidery hotbed. There were a couple experts. And so I was in Lansing, Michigan, and my mother, by the time I got deep into the Hardanger and I won a lot of awards for it, she was like, she didn't know what to teach me next, because she wasn't, I was kind of going beyond where she was. And so she knew enough about what was going on in Michigan, and she took me down to Shea Pendray's. I don't know if you know her. Mm-hmm. Shop, Needle Arts in Dearborn, and said, what do I do with this kid? And Shea had just come back from Japan with Mary Dick Diggs and Audrey Francini and all of these just giants in the embroidery world, and the opening up of Kurnakai to the Western world. And she took one look at me and she said, literally, she's no nonsense. She said, you will become a Japanese embroiderer. And she just started putting the stuff on the table. And my mom, okay.
and you're young and stupid. Why not? Let's go.
Right. I didn't know what it was. The book was fascinating, and it looked really pretty. And she had an ulterior motive, because they were looking for a girl my age to send to Japan.
Oh.
And now my parents ixnayed that after, the next year when they actually offered it to me, probably smartly, that I wasn't the right personality type for that. A little too outspoken as a woman.
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't think you fit that culture well. No.
I didn't know that. They were correct. Now that I'm an adult, I was a little upset at the time, because I would have been a imperial embroiderer. But that didn't mean I couldn't continue to study it. At the same time, Joanne Harvey was teaching all around Michigan with all of her knowledge base on historic samplers, techniques, museum conservation. So here I am, a 13-year-old girl being taught the ancient technique of how to respect and use your materials to their full advantage, at the same time as another woman is teaching me about museum conservation and historic samplers. So you can kind of see where it's going, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
It was kind of a natural evolution to where I am today, and I'm very thankful to call these mentors colleagues now, and we still talk. Shea came and did a whole program on the embroidered jacket for Plymouth. So, and then Mary Dick Diggs became a mentor of mine in Japanese embroidery later. Mm-hmm. But Japanese embroidery is fascinating from a standpoint of, you take only a few raw materials and you can make whatever you want out of them at the frame. So you're given this flat silk that's untwisted, and you twist it yourself. Very powerful way of learning how to embroider, as well as very particular way of stitching. And that infuses all of my embroidery. And you think, oh, well, you're taking Japanese embroidery and you're applying it to Western. And I go, oh, well, just a minute here, because the Japanese have an unbroken history. Western, we do have kind of a broken history in areas in our embroidery past. And when you go back into the 17th century and you start investigating the threads at the level I'm investigating, and the costs of manufacturing and the variability and what does that mean in terms of dyeing and all of that, you start seeing the evidence in the amateur and some of the professional embroiderers' work that they were making threads at their frame with the same techniques that the Japanese do today.
Uh-huh.
And so, and I can prove that too with some portraiture and things like that, where threads are in the background and the raw materials are there. You have to know the Japanese embroidery to be able to
Right.
spot.
Right. Well, see that, and that's another area that intrigues me, and it more so as I talk to various people, is how the techniques moved around the world through history.
Right.
Because I just have this stupid vision that you could put up a gigantic map with pins and thread, and you could, and little flags, and you could illustrate how through history the various techniques moved from this area to this area, got modified and became, this is ours, and then moved on to another spot. To me, it would take forever, but it would be a fascinating study to watch how that all works. And then, can you track it back to one place?
Absolutely. Well, we do know now through work that some researchers have done, and I've done some too, that from primary sources that the sea captains with the East India Trading Company were taking 17th century nightcaps and other items of personal adornment to India and giving them to the Maharajas there. And some of them essentially wrote back saying, this is useless. It's hot here. But our embroiderers are finding them useful to unpick and learn from. And then they started exporting the English 17th century work to the UK.
Uh-huh.
And so not all of the stuff that we think is English is English. Some of it is Indian reproduction of English work.
Mm-hmm.
There's a mind blower for you.
Yep.
Same with the Dutch and the English going back and forth. But you see this all the time, that there are disruptions that occur. As I said, that with the banking industry came into place, there was no need to now store in an identifiable way money in embroidered objects with gold on it. Mm-hmm. And one thing I didn't say, by the way, is all these gold stitches, they take a different amount of gold per unit travel of the stitch. So when we were doing the Plymouth jacket, we realized that there's one jacket at the Met that everybody on the staff thought, oh, let's do this one. This is wonderful. We like this one. And I said, over my dead body. That was my first thing. And they're like, why? And I said, this stitch for these vines is so complicated from how much thread it uses and how much labor it uses. We will never get this project done. And then they went, what? And I said, the stitch that's on the Leighton jacket, we can do quickly. But then to me, all of a sudden I went, well, why did they do that? Because standing 3-4 feet away from that jacket, you cannot tell which stitch it is. I can show you pictures of all the different jackets, and you will not be able to tell. You just say it's gold vine. That's it. Why would they do something that was so much more labor intensive and costly from a gold perspective on it, if not that the culture could read that stitch and say that's more valuable?
Yeah.
Whether it's pawnbroking or an individual trying to achieve status. So that's why I think one reason why I think that stitches were being used as a bank. That's one of the many pieces.
That's so interesting. Yeah, it's that way because I'm storing money right there. Yeah,
exactly. And it was just a period of time when the monasteries had been dissolved, and so the wealthy had all of a sudden gotten so much cash they couldn't buy any more land. They just didn't know what to do with their cash, and the coinage was being debased constantly, shaved. And there was only a couple different ways you could keep money. And you literally use in your house, in a chest.
Right.
So they could convert it to textiles. They could, and that was very identifiable because you can describe it. And you can make plate out of it, meaning goblets and plates. And those were actually like gift cards. You gave them to people and then they melted it down for what they wanted, which is really interesting. But I wanted to mention also what the effect of the world wars has been on needlework. That's something you probably don't realize. And this goes back to manufacturing. In this trying to figure out how to take gold easily through a piece of linen without stripping all the metal off of it, I found that the Japanese needles, which are a different form of needle, worked like butter. Like it made it so easy, it wasn't even funny. And I was like, God, is this the needle shape that they used in the 17th century? So I really started studying needles. And at one point, I was off work because of a repetitive stress thing on my arm in my engineering job, and I had a 2-year-old, and my husband's companies kind of merged, and we basically had to live in Germany for a long time. And all of a sudden, we were in this town called Aachen, Germany, which I did not know was one of the 2 needle-making centers in the Middle Ages and 17th century. Mm. And they have this little sign that they do when they pass you in the car. They take their pinky finger up in the air and they kind of rotate it. Well, that's how you separated the needles as you were to make them roll, just when you're doing quality control as they were being made, which is really cool. And I was like, okay. So I started looking for museums. I found a needle making and other, like scissors and things museum, called them up and they said, oh my God, you must meet Horst. Horst Lang, I don't think any longer with us anymore. He was a wonderful guy. He was one of the last European vice presidents of a needle making company. And he was fascinated by the history of needle making. And as every needle making company kind of went out of business, he bought their archive. Mm. So I visited Horst every single time I was in Germany, and every single time I brought a kind of needlework that I couldn't do anymore, whether it be, embroidery with a chenille from the 1910 or, anything. And I would say, here's the thread, here's the kind of pictures of the old embroidery. We can't seem to do this. The strips, it destroys the thread, etc. And he'd go, oh, and he would open up a little, very German-like, open up a little drawer and unwrap some needle from, 1840. And he had all their archives, so he had sometimes many copies of it, and he would give me a needle. And he says, this is what it is. And then he would describe to me in detail the engineering of the needle, which was just phenomenal. And then he would tell me why it doesn't exist anymore. So the World War was between England, which was the other needle-making center, and Germany for World War I and World War II. They used iron and steel for needle making, and they needed more bullets. And so edicts came down, each one of those world wars, to all companies that used that to reduce their product line. And so they would stop making certain kinds of needles. And that's why we don't do certain embroideries today, because we don't have the tool.
Huh. And that's all lost.
And that's lost.
Yeah.
Now, Horst, I think, willed his collection to the museum, so I know where it is. And I'm fortunate that he gave me a lot of knowledge. So we are trying to remake 1 or 2 of these needles. We're not there yet, Yeah. It's one of those kind of things I'm trying to get to. But we went to a purely stamped needle technique, which leaves burrs on the inside of the needle hole, as well as a long elongated needle, like a very long oval. And before World War I, our needles were primarily, they would stamp the top of the wire and flatten it, and then they would drill a hole which produces no bores in it. So you could have these unique materials inside the needle hole and it doesn't get caught and shredded. And then what they would do is they would take, if you needed to go in and out of something with not such a wide thing at the top, they would grind down the flattened edge so that it was very thin. And that was a hand grind process, which is, a little expensive now.
Right.
But that's why some embroideries are hard to do, like bead embroidery. The needles used for bead embroidery were different in an earlier time frame when the French were doing that amazing work.
See that, and that gets to the magazine that I edit is a manufacturing magazine, and one of the biggest issues that we deal with and will be dealing with for, well, certainly as long as I'm editing the magazine, is this retirement loss of knowledge.
Yes.
And getting it documented. And
yes.
I know you've experienced that and lived it and explored it just in your attempts with needles, but also with thread research. And we really have to be very careful that we don't let any more of that go away.
I agree. And that's one, there's these hidden agendas I have, right? Where I'm interested in these threads, I'm interested in this history and interested in techniques. And part of it is too, providing a large enough market for the skills to be passed down to somebody else. And that's not easy at all. It is very hard. I am proud that we have kept certain businesses in business for probably 10 years longer than they would have been if I wasn't exploring these topics, and have provided a market for a significant number of new thread lines. I'm very careful not to make them exclusive to me so that other designers and teachers can try to use them, to try to give a longer lifetime to them, which then promotes the exchange of the technology base to other apprentices.
Right.
It's unfortunately we keep looking at like apprentices who are in their 50s.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Well, but this is and this gets to the right now we are experiencing an incredible growth and resurgence and explosion, if you will, of needlework. Unfortunately, I think a lot of it just fed by the virus situation we're in.
Yeah.
But and part of what's happened there is it has brought young people in, younger than 50. And we had discussions recently. What do we do to keep that going once the pandemic subsides, which it will at some point? What do we do to capitalize on that and move that forward so that we, like the kind of work you talk about doing, keeping a business in going for another 10 years, that in fact it becomes a thriving thing.
Right. Well, I have a lot of thoughts about this. I know that that there's a significant other piece of my life, which is STEM education of children.
Yes.
And I have 22 teenagers who come to my house to do robotics on a weekly basis. In fact, some of them will be here today after we're done with this podcast. And so hand skill development is one thing that we need to do significantly so people can even get to the point where they can do embroidery.
Let's just focus on that one thing there. Talk about hand skill development, because when you and I talked on the phone several weeks ago, you really opened my eyes to that. I did not realize what an issue that is.
Oh, it's an enormous topic, and it's a topic across the world right now. And we kind of see this today. I mean, us adults are kind of selfish. And unfortunately, we're seeing that in bad behaviors. We want our own time. We've been told we can do what we want to do. But in reality, when you have kids, you're responsible for teaching them certain things, to be good citizens, to be good, to be able to have the skills that they need to survive today. And some of that is the old model making, learning to put a worm on a hook. I mean, these are all hand-eye coordination things, learning to cook, learning to sew, doing some woodworking, putting together, you get something in the mail and it needs to be put together with 5 screws and following directions. People are not doing enough of that with children right now. And that results in things like their inability to track a mouse with the computer screen. Because I work in the urban environments as well, teaching STEM skills. The ability to turn a screw and know when to stop. Or to be able to hold 2 objects together like that, to thread a needle. And it takes a lot of patience on the part of adults, and not to be a perfectionist and let them make mistakes, build on those skills. I don't know if maybe people get my kits and they got to kind of go, that sticker was on that box a little crooked. Well, all summer long, I have kids help me do my manufacturing because they've got to learn the skills somewhere. They've got to learn the skills to put something in a box, because these are the skills that build up and allow you to have somebody that can take on education as a machinist or can take on the education to become a surgeon. Right now, the American Medical Association is begging people to teach kids hobby making, woodworking, and embroidery because their pipeline of kids who have great grades in biology, etc., is fantastic. but they can't tie a knot. And the amount of time, we've reduced the amount of time that somebody can be a resident for obvious reasons of overwork, mistake making, and humanity overall.
Right.
So they're not getting the number of hours in training to become adept with suturing and surgery. So they need to come in with some hand skills, which they used to. They used to come in with hand skills, but they're coming in with zero. So now if you want to be a surgeon and you're coming into medical school, you are actually being asked on your application what hobbies you do. So you get a better, assignment or, admission into medical school if you happen to have been an embroiderer as a hobby as a child, which is fantastic. And, I laugh. Somebody said that you should ask your surgeon before surgery what they did. Choose your surgeon based on their childhood hobbies. I've had some amazing, all my doctors have ever done surgery. I've told them what I do, and they show me their embroidery too.
There we go. Yeah. Well, that was the thing that just, when we were talking on the phone, that would not leave my head, was that you were going into urban environments and literally teaching kids how to turn a screw. Something that I probably learned when I was 5 because I had to haul stuff along while my dad was doing, odd jobs around the house, and it was, here, put this screw in. And you don't even think about it. And then for you to say, I have to go teach that.
Yeah. And I can't teach them robotics or other STEM skills until I've taught them to use a screwdriver. And I live in a well-off area, very educated children, very caring parents, but there's just so few opportunities for kids to do this these days that when they come into my home to do robotics, and they start at 6 at my house, now my last group that will go through with us is now 15. But when we went over from Legos to metal things, they were stripping the heads off of screws at 16 years old, and I'm like, what the heck, But they were, and now they're really good. And I'll tell you, all the kids that come through my robotics program at my house, they get great jobs. They get accelerated because they have hand skills. They can actually do something.
Yeah.
They can solder something. All of that fine motor skill stuff, but it leads to the ability to go into become an electrical engineer or become an electrician, become a machinist or a mechanical engineer, become a surgeon, become a veterinarian. All these things require hand skills,
right.
And we're just not giving them to their kids. And embroidery is a wonderful way to do it.
Yeah.
And I don't necessarily teach all my kids, because I got a lot of boys, embroidery, but I will tell you that almost all the kids that are in my robotics program actually embroidered on the Plymouth jacket.
Oh my! All right.
It's kind of cool when they were young.
Oh yeah. Oh, that's stripping a screw head. Oh geez, that'd get me a whack upside the head from my dad. What are you doing? I showed you how to do that. Now do it right.
We make it a joke, and when we go on, that's the other thing, is that mistakes have to be accepted and
right.
light of, and you give them another piece. That's the only way you can do it. But
it's just you're taking the education of our children back to such very, very basic fundamentals, and to say that they're growing up and getting to high school and don't have those very basics, that bothers me.
Yeah, I laugh that my next career after I finish with my Cabinet of Curiosities is that I'm going to make even more money by hanging a shingle outside my door here in Lexington, Massachusetts, where everybody is incredibly, we're one of the top districts in the nation, incredibly education focused. And everybody, a lot of immigrants in our town, a lot of different ethnicities, just like, our family's mixed too. And that everybody wants their kid to become a doctor or something, or a surgeon or whatever, right? And I said, I could make a lot of money, Dr. Wilson Nguyen, PhD, engineering, MIT, embroidery teacher. You want to have that on your resume?
Yep.
Very expensive embroidery classes for teenagers. That'd be hilarious.
Yep.
But in all seriousness, what you asked about the pandemic and how do we reach the younger generation, there's several keys. Every generation comes to a craft based on some number of people who catch the fire of them and promote their vision, right?
Mm-hmm.
So cross stitch became very big in the United States because of the Danish. Kind of came here, somebody saw what was going on in a revolution of cross stitch in Danish cross stitch. That's the method we use over here. Somebody else was responsible for the explosion of embroidery technique, and of course we know Jane Nicholas was responsible for the explosion of stump work technique in Australia. Somebody else was the whole red work cross stitch, in France. There is a maker movement in the United States which is it's really exploded. And so all of the people below a certain age tend to be already pre-educated to explore the intersection between technology and craft and their own personal vision versus following directions. So prepackaged projects have no interest really to the or replicating what somebody else did has really no interest to the 30-something and under set. Mm-hmm. It's all about independent, creativity and expression. And what they're lacking right now is a lot of easy to understand and use online resources to expand their knowledge of materials and their knowledge of basic techniques. And that's one thing that's my next part of my 10-year plan, Gary. As we've discussed before, that's where I'm pivoting towards, because my audience will have gotten to the pinnacle of embroidery that I want to teach them, and I'm happy to set them free. I'll be going back to the basics for the next generation. They're very interested in, as I said, this exploration between technology and craft. So whether it be color changing threads or it be electronic textiles, which, as you know, is a field that I helped co-invent, I'll be going in that direction with them, and enabling them to explore these materials that they don't know exist, because they're only really finding the materials that are available in Michaels. That's
then the job, your job that you have created and are taking on, but the job ultimately of needleworkers is to help this younger generation by providing them with the materials and the understanding for what they can do and how you might manipulate them.
Right.
And then getting out of their way.
Exactly. That's a really good way to say it, Gary. They're not going to want to embroider the sampler. They will have no interest in that. You may find a certain number of people that you will be able to interest in it by approaching them with the women's history piece of it, let's say. And I don't mean to be sexist and say that the gentleman will not be interested, because of course there's a very strong co-ed aspect to textile history. But you have to approach them from a different standpoint, because the aesthetic of the sampler is not going to interest them. But how you could use some interesting fibers to make, let's say, a three-dimensional squirrel on a piece of fabric that they're going to put in a hoop and put on the wall will very much interest them. And I know some people don't like some of the running stitch phrases that people are using that are a little, either tongue in cheek or a little, profane, right. But that catches their eye.
That's what intrigues me. And I struggle with that because that is so popular among the young people. And I just interviewed Madeline Elizabeth, who is a 16-year-old, and I don't know when the show goes up in relation to when we're recording this, and it doesn't really matter, but very, very talented 16-year-old painted canvas designer. And her best-selling items are those designs that are a word or a phrase.
Right.
And in my mind, it's like, why would you even bother? But they're so popular.
Yeah, well, that's Subversive Stitch was really the first company to do that. She was a bridge individual who bridged between the younger age group and using some of the materials that are available to the wider audience of embroiderers. But it's kind of generational. They'll move away from it. You know that they will. They're angry too. They're angry with some of the things that are going on in the world, and they're expressing themselves. And they've it's kind of like the same as social media, et cetera. The T-shirts, wearing a T-shirt, it's kind of the same thing. It doesn't bother me that much. I'm not necessarily embroidering it and putting it on my walls either, but I'm happy that they're getting the hand skills and that they're moving through a progression of interest in craft that will take them to a different place in the long run.
Yeah, and I don't want people to misunderstand me. I couldn't care less what they stitch. I'm glad they stitch. And if that's what they like doing, then great, because it moves the ball forward. Yeah.
I remember my progression, and it's very instructive to remember if you happen to have started stitching really early, what attracted you at different age points. You can imagine that I don't have a lot of my 12-year-old cross stitch on display at my house. Not too many unicorns and rainbows involved.
Yes.
Right. So by the time I got into college and I was able to really take advantage of the Boston Public Library and see things I never would have before, all the wonderful collection of historic embroidery books, I was looking at this stump work and this 17th century stuff, and I was like, it's dusty and it's gross. How could anybody ever find that attractive or be interested in it? And I mean, at 20 years old, I was like, yuck. Big yuck. And here I am today. Yep. Right? So a lot of it is context. As you learn some skill, you can then look at a skill which is a little bit more difficult than the skill you've just learned, and you can actually read it and say, oh, that's interesting, and you can appreciate it. And it might be used in a context you think is kind of gross looking, but you appreciate the skill. Mm-hmm. And then you might find out a little bit about something historically. Maybe you read an article or somebody, teaches you about, well, this was actually used for this. And you go, oh, that's interesting. And so it's that kind of leapfrogging. And all of a sudden you find yourself, you've got a massive casket project on your hands. And you have left behind some of the other things that you found fascinating. So it's really, it's just your sphere of awareness keeps going, and you progress through things. I did modern samplers. I did Hardanger. I was deep into that. And then, that teaches you one thing, and then you see a 17th century whitework sampler, and you're like, it's kind of Hardanger, but it's not. Right. It's much more complicated. Well, that's fascinating. How did they do that?
Right.
So, and I don't think all people are always interested in progressing up that ladder. Some are very happy with the rhythmicness of certain kinds of stitching, and that's what takes their blood pressure down and finishes their day, and they have accomplishment from that, and that's what they're interested in. Like some people like to run, to do that.
Right.
More power to them. But there is a segment of embroiderers who, when exposed to the cultural aspects or the the technical aspects, all of a sudden get really intrigued and want more. And that is really where the 20, 30 something maker movement is. And anybody who's a maker, like who's making wooden bowls, you tend to find that a maker will cross boundaries because they're just fascinated by process. Mm-hmm. And they're not like wedded, like I'm a woodworker. They're fascinated with how are things made and what were they made out of. And so if you find a girl who is doing knitting, she is the next embroiderer or the next quilt maker or whatever. Or you find a young man who's doing woodworking, he could be the next embroiderer or textile artist or whatever. You just have to expose them to it, and they'll go off running. So that's where I'm kind of setting my sights.
Okay, that's the next step in the 10-year plan then. All right.
It is because honestly, there was a wave of women and men who started to embroider at a certain age or certain time frame, and they've moved through a progression of embroidery, and they're now my students, but they're also in their late 70s. Mm-hmm. And late 60s. And, I've enabled them to do their visions and to work with all the threads. And it's time to find the next group.
Yep. Tricia, thank you. That's been a treat. A lot of fun.
Great. Well, good to talk to you.
Next time, we're going to learn how the next 10-year plan overlaps the current 10-year plan.
Yeah, we'll have to talk again. We didn't even get to talk about my embroidered caskets or anything like that.
Oh, no, that's right. We didn't get to those either. Okay, then we'll do another one. We'll do another one.
All right.
All right. Thanks so much. Thanks to everybody for listening.